بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. اللهم اغفر لنا ولشيخنا ولجميع المسلمين. قال المؤلف رحمه الله: فإن أخبره ثقة بيقين أو وجد محاريب إسلامية عمل بها ويستدل عليها في السفر بالقطب والشمس والقمر ومنازلهما، وإن اجتهد مجتهدان فاختلف جهة لم يتبع أحدهما الآخر ويتبع المقلد أوثقهما عنده، ومن صلى بغير اجتهاد ولا تقليد قضى إن وجد من يقلده، ويجتهد العارف بأدلة القبلة لكل صلاة ويصلي بالثاني ولا يقضي ما صلى بالأول.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء أشرف المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين، أما بعد. So now in the shart of istiqbal al-qibla, in the precondition to the prayer about facing the qibla, we were under the subsection of how to figure out where the qibla is. We began this, we did a line of this last dars, but I'm going to kind of summarize it again. So here, there are two aspects. One is fi hadr, yani when you are present in your own locality or you're muqim somewhere, you're not in safar. And one is fi safar. That which is for hadr, yani for when you are present, is also applicable for that which is in safar, but not عكس ذلك, not vice versa. So what does that mean? There are two things the muallif mentions that if you are resident or traveler, you can establish the qibla by it. And your app and your compass on the iPhone are not those two. And we'll talk about where those would fall. But the first is al-khabar, when somebody informs you. And if that information is from somebody who is thiqatun biyaqinin, if those two qualities are there, then you accept it. We talked about this last dars. Everybody remember it? Inshallah. Tayyib. The other is maharib al-islamiyya, which were the mihrab, as we talked about. Now, just to be clear, those that were made facing the qibla for Muslims. I mean, I don't want you to go and you see some church with a mihrab and you're like, well, mihrab. Yani, you have to know for sure. In our time, let's talk about that. Let's talk about thiqa biyaqeen. So, for example, us, we have apps. Can you consider an app to be thiqa? Khilaf? If the Samsung app or Apple app, is there madahib here? Right? And can you say an app has yaqeen? Right? So it's an interesting paradigm, I guess you could say, right? Because in a way, we do rely on apps for a lot of things. But in reality, if you look at the shari'i aspect of thiqa, we look at those that we can trust their adl, their dabt, their moral character. But here in this bab, we trust their ability to know the qibla. This is not thiqa in the way of mustalah al-hadith. But an app, for example, is not necessarily under that tiding, because an app has no aql of its own. Right? So if your location services or your Wi-Fi or your whatever else that affects the location is off, the app has no ability to determine right or wrong. Now let's talk. So that's talking about yaqeen, right? Thiqa, an app is just running off program. It's not. It doesn't have. You cannot trust or distrust it, right? So neither one of those would be applicable. Really, an app would be closer to what we'll talk about with safar and things, right? Ijtihad. But what is khabar? For example, a brother who lives in a locality, he tells you that I know the qibla, I've looked at where it would be, and I know it to be this way, and he's an honest person, and he is somebody who has yaqeen on what he's saying. So he's reliable himself, he's thiqa, in the sense that he's honest. Not necessarily that he's acceptable in the rawat of Sahih al-Bukhari, right? But he is a trust. He's not a drunk, he's not somebody who openly does fisq, somebody who's halak al-lahya or sharib al-khamar or something. And at the same time, he has yaqeen, like he's sure about the qibla. He's not somebody who's ahbash or something, he's praying the wrong qibla or doesn't know, he's like, I think, right? So now when you have those two, this will work for you in hadar wal safar. Whether you're a resident or if you're traveling and you go by a town and somebody there is thiqa, like you see them to be honest and trustworthy and so on, you can look at the signs of these, and then they know for sure they live there or they're passing there, they have a good compass and they know how to calculate the qibla, and from that they have yaqeen on it and they give you that khabar. Then whether you're a resident or traveler, that is mufid. Maharib al-Islamiyya. So let's say you go to your masjid. And we see this a lot. People go to the masjid and they take out their app and then they try to criticize the masjid. Look, unless the masjid is like way off, like I'm not talking about Masjid al-Haram, like we already talked about there, qareeb when you're there. But when you're like in England or in America, or if you're in Australia, you're not going to be by 1 point something millimeter at the Kaaba anyway. And we told that you have 180 degrees of ijtihad here. You do your best. So if you go to the masjid and the qibla is off 2 degrees or whatever, don't worry about your app. Pray with the Muslims, right? And trust in the Muslims. Unless you know them to be off, right? Like I said, if somebody is from the Ahbash who have they're praying to South Africa or something in America, then that's different, right? Who don't realize the world's round still. They're still using a flat map or whatever. But regularly, when you see the mihrab of a Muslim, you should trust it. And this is in hadar and safar. Meaning if you go to the masjid here next to you, you don't need to go there and be like, which way is the qibla? People are going to think you're nuts, right? You go to a masjid, the qibla is lined out. Khalas, that's it. If you're traveling and you stop somewhere and there's a masjid or a musalla which has a mihrab, then you should assume that it is correct. So you can use that in hadar and safar. So those two, what were the two? Khabar min thiqatin biyaqinin wal mihrab al-Islamiyya. Tayyib. Then the muallif continues to perform istidlal. Istidlal. Yustadl, to make istidlal, to try to figure out, to make ijtihad in a way. عليها في السفر. عليها بأي شيء قبلة. You try to find the qibla in safar, when you're traveling. Why? These, what we're going to mention, and there are going to be 4, are for the traveler, because for the resident, you really shouldn't have to do that. And for the resident, you should know where the qibla is, right? You should have come to yaqeen already. You shouldn't have to do istidlal, because in your own area, you should know the qibla. What kind of a Muslim doesn't know where qibla is, right? Don't talk about the airport you were at. Tayyib. What can you use? Now the muallif mentions 4 things. Qutb. Al-Qutb is the North Star, what we call the North Star. Qutb is what it's called in other languages, and this was the North Star that was used for navigation. And when you know the North Star, and again, I'm not an astronomer or anything like that, but usually you can tell which way north is by the North Star. And if you know which way north is, you can make istidlal. I know you have astronomy weekly. No, I had to change it up a little bit. So if you know how to use the North Star to find direction, as many people are able to, then you can use that. Now, should you use that when you are in your own town? Like when you go to your masjid, should you look for the North Star? No, you should know where the qibla is. But you're traveling, you're going to the desert, you're camping, there is no mihrab for you to look at, there is nobody thiqa, yaqeen, with yaqeen that's there. Here, you can use those things and make istidlal, make ijtihad. You're going to now try to figure out, even though here you may not come to yaqeen. And we'll talk about what to do in that situation. What else can you use? Ash-shams wal-qamar, the sun and the moon. And if it's daytime, you can use the sun and where the sun's whatever phases and solar rays, or what do you call it, the orbit, or what's it called, the orbit,
The track of the sun.
the track. Really, is not, there's not a better word than track. All right, the track of the sun, right? And try to figure out which way the qibla is, right? At the same, like for example, sun rises in the east, right? So if it's early, you can assume that direction. Now, in the winter and summer, there's a little bit differences, so don't go 100% in the track of the sun either. And it sets in the west, right? So if it's Maghrib time and it's setting to a particular direction, then you can assume that's the west. And its phases, yani, in how the sun and the moon and their phase, in the way they, like for example, the moon, it begins in the west. So it's clear and it starts its cycle in the west and it sets towards the east and so on, and their phases. So you can utilize these four things: the North Star, the sun, the moon, and the phases of the sun and the moon, to try to find the qibla when you are traveling. طيب? In the Rawd, يعني in the Sharh Zād al Mustaqni and others and other kutub, they've also said you can look at indicators. Right? You can look at a mountain and be like, okay, I came from this side and that was east, so that I'm going to assume that's east, and then things like this. But again, that shouldn't be when you're at home. That should be when you are traveling. طيب, and if ijtihad is made by two people who are mujtahid, what does it mean mujtahid? Abu Hanifa and Shafi'i, rahmatullah alayhuma. Mujtahid amongst fuqaha are people that have reached a level where they can take from the nusus and make their ijtihad on new masail, right? And that is a big deep subject. I'm giving a very brief definition, right? A mujtahid mutlaq and mujtahid fil madhab and all of that is not what's meant here. And that's why I always understand the istalahat of what you're studying, the terminology. What's meant here is somebody who knows how to make ijtihad on these sabab, these means to know the qibla. This doesn't mean that you're going to look for the Ibn Hazms and a Shawkani and you're like, I think he's mujtahid, let me, la. Yani, here it means it's two people who have abilities to know the signs to find the qibla disagree. What happens now? Let's say we're camping out in a big group, and there are two brothers that are both, mashallah, very knowledgeable Islamically. They're not mujtahid fuqaha, but they know the religion. They know, they've studied these kind of mutun, for example, so they know what they can, they cannot. And they also know astronomy. They have a subscription to Astronomy Weekly. And they check the moon cycles, and they know how to find the North Star and the Big Dipper and Small Dipper and whatever else there is, right? And they look at it and they disagree on the qibla. Now, before I go on the matan, as one of the shuyukh that was teaching Zād al Mustaqni, when I was in Dars, he said very beautifully, he said, look, be careful the matan, don't take it and run with it. Meaning, you may not understand what the muallif is saying. So, what we're talking about is when there's two different aspects of which way the qibla is, not if there is a slight difference. So let's say they both look and one of them says east is this way and the other says east is that way, right? I mean, they're both, so now the qibla is going to come to the polar opposite, or at least maybe a good 90-degree opposite, right? Maybe 180-degree opposite. Now we're not going to talk about, well, it's an acceptable, because now you have ijtihad and there are two different directions. Which way are you going to pray? Right? Here we will separate into three categories of people. Well, yeah, so three categories. One is the mujtahid himself. One is the khalif mujtahid. And one is the muqallid. What does it mean muqallid? And he's Hanafi? Shafi'i? La. This is not about taqleed of madahib. Yani muqallid is going to be the one who does not have the ability to make ijtihad. Right? If I'm out there and we're camping, and somebody asked me which way is the qibla, and I don't have cell phone coverage, and I don't have my watch or anything like that, and I don't have a compass, I cannot look at the stars and tell you which way the qibla is. I'm not even going to try. I'm a muqallid there, right? So I will turn to Abu Ilyas and say, well, all those years of reading Astronomy Weekly, you tell us. He will make ijtihad. I will be his muqallid. I will be his blind follower. Why? Because I don't have the ability to make ijtihad. So he will be a mujtahid and I will be a muqallid. So now we have two people of ijtihad, right? And then you have the regular people that are going to be, so there's three people. The mujtahid who does his best to figure out the qibla, and the other mujtahid who does his best to figure out the qibla and has a small variance. Meaning he says it's this way, the other mujtahid says it's 3 degrees this way. What do you do there? It's just the same direction. Like, why are you fighting about 3 degrees, right? Just put the sajjada right in the middle, you're good, right? You've prayed together. But if there's a 180 degree difference or a 90 degree difference, well, you can't put the sajjada in a 90 degree angle. So what do you do there, right? Well, how are you going to pray that way, right? Which way? So in that case, the two people of ijtihad cannot pray with the others, right? Meaning, if Abdurrahman makes ijtihad and Umar make ijtihad and they're both able, right? They're neither one is a muqallid. They're both able to make ijtihad and they find two different qiblas. If one prays with the others, then he is going khalif to his ijtihad, right? And you cannot pray not facing the qibla. And if you feel this is the qibla, then you cannot pray facing the other's ijtihad. Tayyib?
So what does the muqalladeen do?
Good question. Comes to the third category of people, the muqalladeen. And the muallif answers that here in the matan. The muallif says that regarding the person of taqleed, then he prays behind the one that he sees to be superior in being thiqa and his ijtihad. I mean, here the muallif mentions who has more thiqa between them. But what does that mean, more thiqa? As in the shuruh and the explanations of Zād, it mentions that first the muqalladeen, they look at the two brothers who are making ijtihad and see which one is more able. If one of them is more able than the other, right? Or one of them is more knowledgeable Islamically than the other, or one of them is more pious than the other, then they look for which one is more thiqa and more of a mujtahid, and they pray behind that one. Even if you have two jama'ats there, right? Somebody may take one brother to be more thiqa and somebody else may take the other, right? Now these are rare cases, but they should give you an understanding of usul here. The muqallid, he will make salah behind the one who is mujtahid. But the mujtahid will not take the ijtihad of somebody else khalif to the adillah that he sees in his ijtihad. Tayyib. And if man salla بغير اجتهاد ولا تقليد طيب قضى. What does that mean? Now we're getting to 3 or 4 different masail all in this one little line. One issue gets to be somebody makes salah, they do not try to find the qibla, and they do not follow somebody else who shows them the qibla. They're going somewhere, they stop, they're like, well, whichever way I face is Allah, Allahu Akbar, right? They don't try to find the qibla. That salah is batila. Right? They need to try. Okay? Another category is somebody who makes taqleed, they follow mujtahid, so khalas, their salah is fine. But if you don't do either one of those, you don't try yourself, nor do you follow anybody else, that salah has to be repeated, qada. But there's 2 other or 3 others actually scenarios that will come here. Then you get to the category of those that made ijtihad but they got it wrong. طيب. So they made ijtihad, but after exhausting all the means, they got it wrong. They do not repeat the salah. طيب. So you tried to find the qibla, and there is hadith sahih on this. The Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they made ijtihad, it was wrong, they didn't repeat the salah. They were with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they prayed fajr, after the sun came, they realized they prayed wrong, they didn't repeat the salah, and so on. So because of those adillah, we say when the ijtihad is made and they did their best, then they do not repeat the salah. Tayyib. Then there is the muqallid who could have followed the mujtahid but didn't. Right? The mujtahid says, hey, qibla is that way, and the brother's like, yeah, whatever. And he just makes the salah. And then he realized the qibla was wrong. He has to make qada. He has to repeat it. Tayyib. Then there is the two people of ijtihad who prayed differently. And after they found out that one of them was correct, the other one, what does he do? Repeats his salah. Because there, he had the ability, whatever shortcoming he had. If he didn't have the ability, where he really did exhaust all his means, then he does not repeat the salah. Okay? So if you had the ability, like let's say one person really gave you good adillah, but you still made your own ijtihad, and then you realized that his was correct, even though he had given you those proofs, then you repeat the salah. But if you did your best, then you do not repeat the salah. Tayyib. Tayyib. And if you make ijtihad for the one who's عارف بأدلته, who knows its evidences in the qibla, does he do it for every salah or not? So now what are we talking about? We're not talking about being in your own masjid. Like you don't go to your masjid and think in every salah, hey, which way is the qibla? Like, okay, this is the mihrab, this is the way the qibla is, khalas, yeah, you're done, right? But let's say you're in safar, and now fajr time comes in. But it's still dark. I mean, it starts to get a little light, but it's still dark. And you make ijtihad, I think this is the mountain that is east, and I'm going to make salah if the qibla is east to you. And you make your salah. Now when the sun rises, you realize that's the wrong mountain. طيب? So now for dhuhr, what will you do? First, for fajr, are you going to repeat fajr? No, because you did your best and you prayed, so you don't repeat it. But for dhuhr, what are you going to do? Are you going to say, nope, I'm sticking to it. I'm Pashtun say things once and that's it, my whole life. One Pashtun guy asked him, how old are you? He said, I'm 18. 10 years later, they told him, how old are you? He said, I'm 18. They said, 10 years passed, how come you're 18? He goes, Pathan ki ek zaban. Pashtun says things once, I'm 18, I'm khalas, I'm sticking to it. No. Yani, when you see the sun and you realize that the qibla is another way, now you may not realize which way the qibla is. It's not like the sun comes and a big arrow faces the qibla. But now for every salah, you will make ijtihad. You will make istidlal. Yani you will strive to find the qibla. Now this is for the one that doesn't have yaqeen. This is for, once you have yaqeen, once you're sure one way is the qibla, then khalas, every salah, you don't need to check your app again where your qibla is at home. Right? It's your house. Once you know your qibla, you're good. Right? But if you're traveling and those elements, those adillah that points toward the qibla have changed, like the sun rose or set, or the moon came, or a new path, or somebody had a sign that now that something new came, then in those cases you will continue to make ijtihad for the qibla until either you get yaqeen or that time passes. طيب? For every salah. طيب ويصلي بالثاني ولا يقضى ما صلى بالأول. What does that mean? What is awwal and thani here? Awwal is the first salah you made before understanding the new adillah, and a thani here is the second salah. Meaning, if you looked at the adillah and you prayed fajr in the example that we gave, and then at dhuhr time you realize some new evidences of which way the qibla have come forward. So now he prays dhuhr with the new direction, but he does not repeat the first because he did his best. Tayyib, inshallah, we'll stop here. We'll begin with the niyyah at the next dars. Jazakumullahu khairan.